For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5528 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5528, a bill to evaluate the impact of the lowest price technically acceptable source selection process on national security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 5528, the Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act. Lowest price technically acceptable is a source selection method outlined in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Simply put, this Federal Acquisition Regulation prioritizes price above all else. Prioritizing price over any other technical or operational factors in federal procurement can result in agencies cutting corners, sacrificing long-term value, and potentially jeopardizing national security. The House Oversight Committee in previous Congresses placed appropriate constraints on agency use of the LPTA source selection process to mitigate such concerns. Those constraints recognized that the LPTA standard is not always appropriate when agencies seek to purchase technically innovative services or technology. Therefore, my bill requires the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to conduct a government-wide evaluation of the LPTA source selection process to determine if it is being used in a way that creates any national security risks. This is a useful step forward, understanding how agencies are using LPTA in their source selection decisions, and will determine whether agencies are relying on LPTA when it is not appropriate. This review is a common sense step to ensuring America's national security while also reducing supply chain risks to federal agencies. I thank my colleague from Virginia, Mr. Jerry Connolly, and my colleague from Colorado, Ms. Lauren Boebert, for their support in drafting this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support this simple and necessary bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The gentleman's legislation, H.R. 5528, the Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act, would require the Director of OMB to review the procurement management practices of federal agencies to determine whether the use of acquisition procedures focused exclusively on cost, known as lowest price technically acceptable, or LPTA, poses any national security risks. Since our committee reported this bill last September, I appreciate that Mr. Donalds and the majority sought and incorporated feedback from the administration and also earned bipartisan support with the co-sponsorship of Mr. Conley, a longtime expert in federal operations. With these updates, I'm happy to lend my full support to this legislation. When federal agencies purchase goods or services, they strive to achieve the best value for the American people. In the words of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, best value means that the acquisition should provide, quote, the greatest overall benefit in response to the requirement. Under LPTA procedures, price is the controlling factor in awarding a contract with no consideration given to any other factors. This contrasts with the more frequently used trade-off approach, which looks at the bigger picture and considers additional factors beyond just cost, perhaps assessing elements like quality and performance or a bidder's technical or managerial expertise. This bill and the trade-off approach to federal contracting take into consideration that focusing on contract price alone can actually increase the overall cost to the federal government and the people. For example, cutting costs in the short term can lead to expensive project delays or might result in taxpayer dollars flowing to adversarial nations that threaten our national security. If no consideration is given to the strength and integrity of a bidder's supply chain, cutting costs in the short term could lead to inferior products or disastrous supply shortages at key moments. So I am happy to give my support to this legislation. I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves his time. The gentleman from Florida is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I have no further speakers on this bill and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
No further speakers. And I reserve the balance of my time. I'm ready to close.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'll yield the balance of my time if the gentleman's ready to close.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Safe and Smart Federal Purchasing Act is measured and targeted legislation that can inform future congressional work on federal procurement, a policy area where we know is ripe for reform and taxpayer savings. I encourage my colleagues in the House to support this common sense bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5528 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and with
Madam Speaker.
On the
Madam
table.
Speaker. Madam Speaker.
purpose does the gentleman from Florida?
I actually request the yeas and nays on the measure.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.